Welcome back. This is You've Heard It Said, where faith meets history and the stories we thought we knew come alive. I'm Brie Rosalie, and this is part 6 of our Egypt in the Bible series. Last time, we spent the whole episode with Joseph, but now we move forward in our story when a new king rose and Israel went from guess to threat overnight. Let's get into it. Exodus 1:8, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. The temptation is to read that as forgetting, like Egypt just misplaced the file somewhere between dynasties. But political forgetting is almost never accidental. When a new regime comes to power and the previous administration's heroes quietly vanish from the record, that's policy, not negligence. Egypt was very good at this. Akhenaten, the pharaoh who temporarily rewrote Egyptian religion around a singular solar deity, was erased so thoroughly after his death that the 19th century Egyptologists had to piece his existence back together, largely from the ruins at Amarna. His temples demolished, his name chiseled off monuments, and his entire religious revolution treated like it never happened. Footnote: Egypt's habit of inscription and reinscription is part of what makes it endlessly interesting. A pharaoh would add his name to a predecessor's monument, claiming the work as his own. It was practically a royal tradition. Ramses II took that knowledge and flipped it. He inscribed his name on the bottom of an obelisk that's now at the Grand Egyptian Museum, like Andy labeling Woody. You can only see it if you're standing directly underneath it, which is how it got its name, the hanging obelisk. He knew whoever came after him would do exactly what every king before him had done, because he had done it too. He was right about the pattern and wrong about the outcome. Ozymandias himself. End footnote. He did not know Joseph isn't forgetting. It's a decision. And once you've decided a legacy is inconvenient, the people attached to it become a problem. Before we go further, I want to address something I get asked constantly. When did this happen? Which pharaoh are we talking about? Can we place any of this in Egyptian history? The honest answer, it depends on the timeline. Scholars disagree, and I think it's worth laying out both camps clearly. The early date, around 1446 BC, works backward from 1 Kings 6:1, which says Solomon built the temple 480 years after the Exodus. Crunching the numbers lands you in the 18th dynasty, with Thutmose III as the likely oppressor pharaoh and Amenhotep II as the pharaoh of the actual Exodus. This is also the window where the Hyksos theory fits best, which I'll get into in a moment. The late date, closer to 1270 to 1250 BC, points to Exodus 1:11, which names the store cities the Hebrews built as Pithom and Ramses. If the city is literally called Ramses, as the argument goes, a pharaoh named Ramses was probably in the picture, and that puts you in the 19th dynasty, Ramses II as the oppressor and his son Merneptah as the pharaoh of the Exodus. Footnote: speaking of timelines, I suppose one watch of The Prince of Egypt tells you which camp DreamWorks decided to land in. I also suspect that Ray Fiennes voicing Amenhotep II just doesn't have the same ring to it as Ramses the Great. End footnote. Neither timeline gives us the thing everyone wants, an Egyptian record that mentions any of this. No Hebrew vizier by the name of Joseph, no slave census, no plague account. Now, before that feels defeating, I want to say something about why the silence doesn't actually close the door. Egypt didn't record its defeats. It also didn't record the administrative details of conscripted foreign labor in the Delta, which was considered low-status work beneath historical notice. The Exodus, if it happened as described, involved miraculous events and a humiliating loss for the world's greatest empire. You would not expect them to write that down. The absence isn't proof it didn't happen. It's exactly what you would predict if it did. What we do have is the Merneptah Stele, a victory inscription from around 1207 BC. Pharaoh Merneptah, Ramses II's son, lists the people he's conquered or subdued in the Levant, and buried toward the end, almost as an afterthought in a long list of victories, is one clause, quote, "Israel is laid to waste," end quote. One line. But it's the earliest known external mention of Israel as a people in any Egyptian text. And here's something I got to see firsthand at Karnak. There's a damage relief from the same campaign that some scholars believe may actually show Israelites. When I was there with our Egyptologist guide, standing in front of that relief, he seemed entirely confident about what we were looking at. I took a video of it. I stared at it for a while. And as much as it's images of defeated people of war, there's something strangely moving about the possibility that the first image of the people of Israel in Egyptian art is on a wall in a victory scene, listed among the defeated, visible because someone bothered to document that they existed. I mentioned the Hyksos in the Joseph episode as one example of how Egypt absorbed useful foreigners. Now, let me bring them back here and actually connect them to the timeline debate. As a reminder, Hyksos were Semitic people who migrated from Canaan into the Nile Delta around 1650 BC and eventually became rulers of northern Egypt. Their capital was Avaris, right in the same Delta region as Goshen. The theory? If Joseph served under a Hyksos pharaoh, a fellow Semite who had cultural reason to trust a Hebrew administrator, then the new king, who did not know Joseph, is the native Egyptian dynasty that expelled the Hyksos around 1550 BC. Under that reading, it's not just that they forgot Joseph, the new government actively rejected everything the previous regime represented, including its Semitic relationships. This fits the early date timeline. But as I mentioned last episode, this theory has limits. And the scholar I've been leaning on for the archaeology side of this series, Amanda Hope Haley, puts it directly. The Hyksos-Israel connection is a really compelling theory, but it's not a perfect theory. The big problem is the ending. The Hyksos were conquered and expelled by force. That's not Israel's exodus. Israel leaves under divine pressure, not military defeat. And there's no Egyptian record of a Hebrew vizier in any period. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Joseph's Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah, and his father-in-law's name, Potipharah, have actually been used to try to pin the story to a specific period. The name structure of Potipharah appears to begin in the New Kingdom in the 19th dynasty, around the time of Seti I and Ramses II in the 13th century BC. If that linguistic analysis holds, it actually supports the late date, which means even the names in Joseph's story may be subtly pointing to Ramses' Egypt rather than the Hyksos era. We don't know for certain, but the fact that we can have this conversation at all, that the names, the cities, the archaeological record, and the inscriptions can be examined and compared is itself remarkable. These are not myths from nowhere. They're rooted in a world that left evidence. We just haven't found all of it yet. And I actually find that exciting rather than troubling. If everything were settled, I'd have less to talk to you about. Whatever the exact timeline, Exodus 1, 9 through 10 is unambiguous about what Pharaoh does next. Quote, "The Israelites have become far too numerous and powerful for us. We must deal shrewdly with them. Or if there's war, they might join our enemies, fight against us, then leave the country." End quote. The fear isn't that they're criminals. It isn't that they're unproductive. The fear is that they're too numerous, too capable, and potentially disloyal in a crisis. That's demographic anxiety. It follows a pattern across human history with depressing consistency. A group gets welcomed in because they're useful, they establish themselves and grow, and then when the dominant culture feels threatened by something, a political shift, an external pressure, the same group gets reframed. Their numbers become dangerous and their competence becomes suspicious. Once you've established the threat narrative, the next move is labor control. Pharaoh doesn't expel them. They're too economically valuable. He conscripts them. And suddenly you have slave masters, forced labored, and store cities, Pithom and Ramses. A quick note here, because I know some of you are picturing it in your minds. The Hebrews did not build the pyramids. I say this because when I tell people I've been studying Egypt in the Bible, that's usually the first question. Well, second after aliens, but that's another podcast. The pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom, thousands of years before any plausible Exodus timelines place Hebrews in Egypt at all. I hate to break it to you, but no serious scholarship puts them there. Footnote: the pyramid builders were actually Egyptian workers, skilled laborers fed and housed by the state, many of them buried with honor near the pyramids they built. We know this because archaeologists have found their villages and tombs. I've seen some of these myself at Giza. They're nestled right between the pyramids and the Sphinx, a place of honor and importance to be buried right by their king, not somewhere you would house or bury slaves. The slave-building pyramids image comes mostly from Hollywood. And you have to hand it to them. Storage cities are considerably less cinematic than pyramids, which is actually what the book of Exodus says Hebrews were building in Exodus 1:11. Less iconic, but arguably more important in the grand scheme of things. But the box office loves spectacle over bureaucracy. End footnote. A quick word on what labor actually looked like. What Egypt practiced in large building projects was largely what historians call corvée labor, state-mandated work service imposed on subject peoples. It wasn't identical to the chattel slavery of the antebellum American South that you automatically picture when you hear the word slavery, but I don't want that distinction to do too much softening here, because Exodus is unambiguous. This was brutal. The text says Egypt made their lives bitter. There are midwives who were ordered to kill Hebrew baby boys at birth. Whatever the technical category, this was systemic, violent oppression designed to break a people. Now, I want to tell you something that happened when I was in Egypt a few weeks ago, because it changed how I read Exodus 1. I encountered it everywhere I went, this deep, almost fierce pride in being Egyptian. Not just national pride the way you'd expect from any other country, something older than that, more rooted. At one point, an Egyptologist guide put it in a way that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He said, "Even though our lips speak Arabic, our hearts are still Egyptian." That stayed with me for the rest of the trip. And then another guide in a completely different part of the country elaborated on something similar. He also said that Egypt's borders have never really changed. Now, technically, that's not quite precise. Egypt at its New Kingdom peak controlled territory into modern Syria, and modern Egypt is considerably smaller politically. But I think what he meant was something more specific and more true. The Nile Valley, the inhabited core, the strip of arable land between desert and desert that has been essentially the same place, home to essentially the same people for 5,000 years. Egypt is the Nile, and that hasn't changed. Egypt may be the only ancient civilization with genuine demographic continuity in the same geographic location across 5 millennia. Language changed, religion changed, rulers changed. Look at the Hyksos, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Ottomans. But the people stayed, and almost every foreign ruler who came in eventually became Egyptian. They styled themselves as pharaohs, they built in the Egyptian style, they even adopted their gods. Egypt absorbed its conquerors more than it was absorbed by them. That's what made those encounters with those guides so useful for me as someone trying to bring these texts to life. I now understand something visceral about the cultural gravity of Egypt. The pride, the rootedness, the sense that this is who they are and they did not dissolve. And when I read something like, "A new king arose who did not know Joseph," I can feel the weight of it differently now. This wasn't just a political turnover. It was Egypt being Egypt. That deep, unshakable sense of self reasserting after a period of disruption or foreign influence. And in a culture with that kind of pride, a large Semitic population living on your border, using your resources, growing in number, that's not going to feel like a legacy worth honoring. It's going to feel like a threat. Whatever the exact timeline, the cultural logic here is the same. Joseph's legacy didn't just fade, it became a liability. And if Egypt's story is about the weaponization of forgetting, erasing what was inconvenient, Israel's wilderness story is almost the mirror image. Not strategic erasure, but something more human, selective nostalgia. Numbers 11:5, quote, "We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic," end quote. They've remembered the menu and completely edited out the whips. Memory is selective. Empires do it for political reasons. Hungry, exhausted people do it for very human ones. The distortion works the same way. Footnote: this is why Deuteronomy repeats the word remember with almost obsessive frequency. The book functions as a long antidote to selective memory. Quote, "Remember you were slaves in Egypt. Remember what God did. Remember where you came from," end quote. The command to remember isn't nostalgic, it's protective. A people who forget their story are much more easily reshaped by someone else's version of it. End footnote. I know we spent time with the midwives in our households episode in part 4, but I want to return to them here, because in the context of this episode, their story lands a little differently. This episode is all about the politics of forgetting, about who gets remembered and who gets erased. And here, tucked into the machinery of oppression, is this: Pharaoh is never named in Exodus 1, hence all of our timeline questions. He's just the king of Egypt. But these two women operating at the absolute margins of power are named: Shifra and Puah. The empire is anonymous. The resistors are remembered. In a story about forgetting, they're what the Hebrew tradition chose to preserve. Here's what stays with me about Goshen. This is a story about who gets to control the narrative. Egypt had every tool of power at its disposal: the monuments, the records, the administrative machinery of the ancient world's greatest empire. And they used it to erase, to rewrite, to make inconvenient people invisible. But the Hebrew tradition did something Egypt never anticipated. It remembered. Not just the deliverance, but the suffering too. It preserved the bitterness alongside the miracle. And in a story where the most powerful man in the world doesn't even get a name, two midwives do, Shiphrah and Puah. And it starts here in Goshen, before the burning bush, before the plagues, before any of the dramatic machinery of liberation is in motion. It starts with a community that refused to let the powerful write the only version of the story. Next time, we meet the man God would eventually use to take that refusal all the way to Pharaoh's doorstep. Raised inside the palace, educated in everything Egypt had to offer, and then stripped of almost all of it before he could be sent back. That's part 7, Moses, Imperial Formation and Divine Calling. For more historical context and scripture readings to go deeper into this week's topic, check out the reading plan at you'vehearditsaid.substack.com, or you can find the link in the show notes. Thank you again for listening. I'll see you next time.